You were never meant to hear this. Buried beneath centuries of silence, beneath the frozen soil of Maine's forgotten frontier, lies a truth so twisted, so surgically erased, that even history itself turned its gaze. A name, Ashford, echoes like a curse in forgotten ledgers and shuttered archives. And tonight, for the first time in over 200 years, you're going to understand why. You see, some stories aren't written in ink. They're etched in bone, and the tale of the Ashford family is one such horror, concealed behind the granite walls of a convent that never served God. Not really. What lived inside those walls served only power. It began with 3 women, Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance Ashford, who arrived not as missionaries but as architects of silence. They claimed to bring salvation, but salvation was just a word. Behind it hid something far more calculated, a controlled disassembly of the human soul. They didn't wear the robes of tyrants. They wore veils, crosses, smiles. But make no mistake, these were not servants of light. They were surgeons of darkness. And their sanctuary, built deep in the Maine wilderness in 1798, was not a place of healing. It was a place of extraction. Extraction of what, you ask? Free will. Behind those stone walls, obedience wasn't taught. It was installed. Through methods older than Christianity, older than empires, techniques that whispered of ancient bloodlines and pre-Christian science, forbidden techniques, inherited, perfected, and disguised under layers of holy cloth. Women entered that place as rebels, unmarried, unruly, inconvenient. They came defiant, curious, alive. They left, different. Some didn't leave at all. The town of Millbridge called it the Convent of Eternal Tears. Fitting, isn't it? But tears weren't the end goal. Compliance was. The kind of compliance you can't unlearn. The kind that severs Iden, tighty, at the root. And the most terrifying part, they succeeded. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about history, religion, and control. It will expose how institutions sanctify horror when it serves order, and how far people will go, not for God, but for dominion. You've just stepped into a labyrinth of mirrors, behind each one, a reflection you were never allowed to see. Stay close. Because the descent begins now. Let's go back to the beginning, before the Ashfords had a name soaked in dread, before the convent, before the screams. Back to England, 1764, a private estate in the moors of North Yorkshire. Records say it was a school for wayward girls, but even then rumors bled through the countryside like rot through silk. They called it the Red House, a place where daughters of the nobility were sent when they were inconvenient, too intelligent, too rebellious, too damaged. You can find fragments of the Red House in the handwritten letters of housemaids and the journals of a disgraced bishop. All of them hint at the same terrible suspicion. This was not a school. It was a crucible, a forge for something unspeakable. And the Ashfords were its final product. Agatha, the eldest, was not born into the bloodline. She was selected, chosen at age 11 for what the records call her extraordinary retention and lack of emotional volatility. That's not praise. That's a blueprint. From that moment forward, she wasn't raised. She was conditioned. Sister Prudence, born of the Ashford line but rumored to be the result of something darker, illegitimate, possibly inbred. Whispers say yes. Her father's name was erased, replaced with a seal, a red serpent wound around a cross. And Temperance, the youngest, no birth records, no parish documentation, just a single reference in a ledger labeled acquired. That word should haunt you, because what they acquired wasn't just a child, it was a vessel. By 1797, the Red House mysteriously burned to the ground. No investigation, no arrests. But days later, a ship departed from Liverpool carrying 3 women under false names, bound for the New World. Why Maine? Because it was lawless, isolated, ripe, and because what they were about to do required silence. See, the Ashfords weren't fleeing persecution, they were following instructions. A doctrine passed down through secret societies older than the church they claimed to serve, orders that came from men who never wrote their names, only symbols, spirals, eyes, numbers. The ship's manifest listed them as Anglican missionaries, but those who met them at port reported something else: the way they stood too still, the way they never blinked at suffering, and the way Agatha spoke Latin fluently, backwards. The Convent of Eternal Tears didn't start in Maine. It started in blood, in silence, and in a house that England itself tried to forget. And you're about to learn why forgetting was the only defense we ever had. They arrived in Millbridge like a blessing wrapped in velvet, composed, elegant, holy. And yet, even the animals grew silent when they passed. October 1798. The town barely numbered 300, a crude outpost against wilderness, harsh winters, harder lives. People didn't ask too many questions, especially not when gold flowed as freely as blessings. Agatha Ashford, the so-called Mother Superior, stepped off that wagon in garments too fine for the frontier. Her speech, measured, perfect. Her eyes, gray but empty, as if something behind them waited to be let in. She called their mission divine, claimed they were Anglican refugees fleeing spiritual oppression. She quoted scripture with flawless precision, but never referenced the Gospels directly, only the Book of Lamentations, always Lamentations. She bought 200 acres of forest, paid 3 times market value, in gold, no bartering, no hesitation. When the townspeople asked where the funds came from, she smiled and said, "Our order receives support from those who understand the weight of human suffering." No one pressed further, not in a place where hardship made silence a virtue. Construction began immediately, but what rose from the frost-bitten earth wasn't a convent. It was a fortress, 3 stories of cold, unyielding stone. No bell tower, no chapel, no crosses on the exterior walls, just narrow, high windows that let no light out and no truth in. The basement, if it can even be called that, was the most disturbing part. Reinforced masonry, drainage systems like those in slaughterhouses, ventilation tunnels mapped by Agatha herself, designed with surgical precision. One mason reportedly asked if it was to house livestock. Agatha answered, "Of a kind." By spring, the Convent of Eternal Tears stood complete, a gray monolith wrapped in mist pressing into the earth like a sealed tomb. The townspeople were invited to a dedication ceremony. There was no sermon, no hymns, only a recitation in Latin, spoken by all 3 sisters in perfect unison, each voice harmonized like they'd rehearsed for decades. Some of the old-timers said they recognized none of the verses. One man, who'd served in the war and heard every manner of Christian rite, whispered, "That wasn't a blessing, that was a binding." Within weeks, the first patients arrived. Unmarried mothers, women who talked too much, daughters who wouldn't obey. They were dropped off by fathers, brothers, husbands, handed over like broken tools. None of them knew what would happen behind those stone walls. But the Ashfords did. They had known for years. Because this wasn't charity. It was harvest. And harvest had just begun. You must understand something now, before we go any deeper. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic correction. A refinement of methods passed down through unbroken hands, older than science, older than religion. The Ashfords didn't invent horror. They inherited it, polished it, perfected it, and they hid it behind ritual. The Convent of Eternal Tears was a machine, and women were its fuel. They arrived under the guise of healing. Families paid good silver, believing their wives and daughters would be restored, remade into obedient, pure versions of themselves. But what they got back wasn't what they sent in. Those who returned from the convent were different, too quiet, too calm. Their eyes never moved like they used to. Their voices sounded memorized. One husband reported his wife could no longer cry, even when their child died in her arms. She looked at him, he said, like he was a burnt biscuit. Worse still, most never came back at all. When questioned, Agatha explained, "Some spirits are too shattered to return to the world. They've chosen to remain in our care for their own safety." And the town, eager to believe in goodness, nodded along. After all, what kind of monster questions the word of holy women? But the truth was this: Those who stayed were the ones who screamed, and the Ashfords didn't let them leave. They were test subjects, iterations in a generational experiment in obedience. And it worked. Inside the convent, Sister Prudence, silent, surgical, had developed a technique she called the silencing. It involved isolation, prayer, ritual fasting, and something else. Something that required physical restraint and tools made of bone and steel. We know this from a recovered page of her personal codex, discovered in 1891 behind a collapsed wall. The page had no title, only a diagram of a human skull. Certain pressure points were marked. Notes in the margins referenced will disruption and emotional attenuation. It was not medicine. It was engineering of the soul. Temperance, the youngest, was in charge of preparation. She selected the subjects, bathed them, prayed with them, earned their trust, and when the time came, she was the one who held their hands as Sister Prudence began her work. These weren't sisters. They were a trinity of calculated control. Agatha was the doctrine. Prudence was the scalpel. Temperance, the lure. By the winter of 1801, the Convent of Eternal Tears had already transformed over 70 women. Not healed, not saved, rewritten. And no one in Millbridge had the courage to ask how. It was a boy who saw too much. Thomas Brewster, age 20, a trapper, born and raised in the cold silence of Maine's wilderness. He knew the sounds of night, knew the cry of a fox from the scream of a panicked deer, and he knew, without question, that what he heard outside the convent that February night was human. He was tracking a wounded buck just beyond the Ashfords' land. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Then it came, a scream so raw, so full of splintering pain, it stopped his breath in his lungs. Then another, and another, not one voice, several. They rose in waves, some fading into dry sobs, others twisting into howls that sounded like something was being torn loose from inside them. He left the hunt behind and moved toward the sound. Through the snow, through branches that cut his face, through cold that bit his bones, until the convent came into view. It stood silent, windows dark, but the sound was coming from below, from the earth. He found a basement window, half covered in frost. What he saw inside didn't just scar him, it split his life into before and after. There was a woman on a table, not lying, strapped, her wrists bound, her head fixed in a brace. Her skull had been shaved. Black lines drawn in ink traced pathways across her scalp. She was screaming, begging, but no one was listening. Sister Prudence stood over her, calm, focused. Her pale hands guided a thin metal rod, inserted through the skull, probing, not violently, not angrily, clinically, like a mechanic tuning an engine. Agatha stood nearby, recording notes, watching, not a flicker of emotion on her face. She could have been watching paint dry. And Temperance held the woman's hand, whispering, smiling, encouraging her through the agony with the tone of a lover, a comforter. But it wasn't comfort, it was containment, manipulation disguised as care. And as Thomas watched, the woman's screams faltered, then stopped. Her eyes froze open, but her mouth kept moving, whispering something in Latin. Thomas didn't breathe again until he was halfway back to town. He burst into his father's workshop, raving, desperate to make someone, anyone, believe him. But here's what no one tells you about truth. The deeper it cuts, the less people want to see it. And what Thomas saw that night was a blade, one meant to sever the soul. The town didn't believe him. They couldn't. Millbridge wasn't built on stone, it was built on denial. Survival demanded it. You don't last long in the wilderness without learning to look away from what you're not strong enough to change. Thomas's father was a practical man. He didn't call his son a liar. He called him tired, delirious from the cold. You were chasing blood through snow in the dark, he said. Sometimes the mind makes ghosts out of shadows. But Thomas hadn't seen ghosts. He'd seen ritualized mutilation, surgery with purpose, obedience extracted like poison from a wound. His descriptions were too precise, He described the metal rod, the ink markings on the scalp, the brace that held the head still. These weren't the imaginations of a panicked child. They were the words of someone who had seen an operation. And yet, silence. Even those who halfway believed him said nothing. Why? Because the Ashfords were sacred in that town. They dressed modestly, spoke sweetly, gave generously. They held prayer vigils, helped with funerals, handed out medicine to the poor, and most importantly, they made troubled women disappear. That's a service men in power don't question. They pay for it. So Thomas was labeled disturbed, sensitive. Some even whispered the convent had refused to treat his own mother years before, and this was his revenge, the kind of lie that feels like truth when it protects the status quo. But there was one man who listened. Deacon Morrison. The moral backbone of Millbridge. A quiet, pious man who had served through the war, lost a son to illness, and refused to take a bribe even when it cost him his farm. He didn't say much at first, just nodded, asked questions, listened. Then, 1 week later, he visited the convent. He said it was about fundraising for the church. Mother Agatha welcomed him like an honored guest, tea, sweetbread, lesson smiles. And when he brought up the strange sounds reported by hunters, she didn't flinch. She explained they performed intensive nocturnal prayers, that evil does not release its hold on the soul quietly. She said the screams were a sign of healing, and she was so calm, so convincing that Deacon Morrison almost believed her. Almost. Because as she led him through the convent's upper halls, past silent women with hollow eyes and synchronized movements, a thought crept into his mind like a whisper. These aren't women anymore. They're programs. And someone, something, is running them. The deacon left the convent smiling, nodding, thanking the sisters for their hospitality. But the moment he was out of sight, his expression broke. Something was wrong, profoundly, inescapably wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the women inside had moved, not like people, but like rituals given flesh. They didn't blink, they didn't speak, they didn't even pray like normal believers. They recited, and when he tried to meet their eyes, it was like staring into a well with no bottom. Back in town, he said nothing. At first, he spent a full day in prayer, another reading scripture. Then, quietly, he began to ask questions, careful ones, to trusted friends. Has your daughter written since her treatment began? Did your wife seem the same when she returned? Did she remember your name immediately? The answers terrified him. Most said no. Some hadn't received letters in months. One merchant's wife, after 3 months in the convent, returned unable to speak without stuttering unless she was reciting scripture. Another man confided that his daughter now slept with her eyes open and whispered Latin phrases in her sleep. And yet, none of them had dared speak out. Why? Because the transformations had solved problems. Their wives no longer challenged them. Their daughters no longer refused orders. There was peace in the home, quiet, obedience. They were broken, yes, but beautifully so. And that was the true horror, wasn't it? The convent didn't destroy these women. It redesigned them. But it gets worse. The deacon found records, handwritten receipts in the town's archive, filed under charitable donations. They weren't donations. They were fees. Families had paid in silver, sometimes livestock, sometimes land deeds, in exchange for complete reformation. The terminology chilled him. Reformation. Not healing, not counseling, but a word used by blacksmiths and masons, a word for reshaping something into a new form, one that serves better. He took those documents to the town constable, and the constable's response? He burned them, right there, in his fireplace, without a word. The Ashfords, he said, had done more good than harm. That was all. Deacon Morrison understood then. Millbridge was no longer a town. It was a farm. And the Ashfords were not its shepherds. They were its engineers. There comes a moment in every descent where you realize there's no going back. The veil's been lifted. The air tastes different. You're no longer just observing evil. You're breathing it in. For Deacon Morrison, that moment came in the dead of night. He awoke to a sound, low, rhythmic, like distant chanting. It wasn't coming from the town. It was deeper, older, vibrating from the trees themselves, as if the forest had begun to hum. He followed it, alone. No lantern, no rifle, just the moonlight, cold and pale, guiding him back toward the convent, and what he saw beneath that building would become the final page of his journal. We don't know how he got inside, but we know what he found. He described a stone corridor beneath the convent, too old to have been built in 1798. The walls were smooth, carved with spirals, runes, and symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. Not paint, not of this age. He said the stone pulsed when he touched it, like skin, like it was breathing. And at the end of that corridor was a room, circular, silent, lit by blue fire from bowls that never burned out. In the center, an altar, not Christian, no cross, no saints, just a slab of black stone etched with a symbol seen only once before. In the ashes of the Red House in England, a red serpent wound around a cross, its mouth devouring its own tail, and surrounding that altar were the Ashford women, unhooded, unmasked. Their faces were wrong. Prudence's skin was too tight, stretched like porcelain over something not meant to wear it. Agatha's eyes no longer blinked. They glowed faintly like embers starved of oxygen, and Temperance, young, beautiful Temperance, was chanting in a voice not her own. They were performing a ritual, but it wasn't prayer, it was extraction. Atop the altar was a woman, bound, still alive but no longer screaming. Her eyes were rolled back, her lips moved, as if whispering secrets to someone only she could see. And above her head, floating in the air, was a shadow, a shape with no source, shifting, twitching. The deacon's final words were these: "They are not healing souls, they are harvesting them. They feed something below this world, something patient, something ancient." That was the last entry. He vanished the next day. His Bible was found torn open, pages cut into ribbons, his heart still inside, but his eyes gone. After the deacon disappeared, something changed. Millbridge did not mourn him publicly. A man of his stature vanishing without ceremony should have shaken the town to its core, but instead there was silence, a thick, unnatural stillness that spread like frostbite through the bones of the community, the kind of silence that's not from ignorance, but consent. No funeral, no town meeting, just a brief note in the weekly ledger. Presumed lost in the woods. But you and I know better now, don't we? By spring of 1804, the Convent of Eternal Tears had expanded, not in size, but in reach. Women weren't just being sent from Maine anymore. They were arriving from Boston, Providence, even as far as Baltimore. Politicians, ministers, wealthy merchants, all sent their wayward wives and daughters north to the place where disobedience was cured, and the Ashfords welcomed them all. But now the price had changed. No longer silver, no longer livestock. Now they wanted names. That's what one surviving letter from a Boston widow reveals. Her husband, a magistrate, had sent their daughter to the convent after she publicly criticized his business dealings. Weeks later, he received a letter from Agatha, not requesting payment, but instructions, specific names, women to watch, families to observe. The convent was evolving. No longer just a forge for obedient women, it was becoming a network, a silent mechanism of influence. Transform one daughter, and you reshape a household. Transform a dozen, and you govern a town. Control 100, and you can steer the will of a state. But even more disturbing than their reach was their permanence. Because by 1806, not one of the original patients had died. Not one. No gravestones, no records, just vanished women, unaccounted for, decade after decade. The few who did return were watched carefully and none aged. Their skin stayed smooth, their voices never wavered. One even reportedly survived a fall from a second-story window without a single broken bone. When someone asked Agatha how this was possible, she replied, "When the soul is unburdened of conflict, the body follows. We have removed pain from them, and in pain's absence, time grows still." But we know the truth. They hadn't removed pain. They had replaced it with obedience so complete it calcified the soul, trapped it, preserved it. These women weren't alive anymore. They were installations. And whatever ancient force the Ashford served, it was building something. Brick by brick, body by body. Let me tell you something most men never realize until it's too late. Control is not imposed. It is invited, slowly, subtly, with trust. And the Ashfords mastered that game centuries before Millbridge was ever carved into a map. By 1811, whispers about the convent had reached the ears of federal agents. There were too many missing persons, too many wives and daughters gone without explanation. An internal memorandum from a U.S. Marshal's office, recently declassified, described the convent as a suspected site of mass institutional abuse under the guise of religious correction. An agent was dispatched. His name was Silas Crane, a veteran of the French wars, skeptical of religion, loyal only to the truth. He arrived in Millbridge under a false identity, posing as a clerical archivist researching new Anglican settlements. What he found wasn't faith. It was architecture built for submission. He posed as a preacher, observed the townsfolk, interviewed families. Some were open. Many were evasive, but one old man, blind in one eye, said something that chilled Silas to his core. "They don't fix broken women up there. They gut 'em, then fill what's left with silence and scripture." Silas made 2 attempts to infiltrate the convent. The first time he was turned away politely. Temperance met him at the gate, her face radiant with innocence. "No men allowed," she said sweetly. "Our work is delicate and private." The second time he returned at night, through the forest, past the streams and old hunting trails. He'd memorized the layout based on accounts from those who'd helped construct it years ago. He reached a rear entrance, broke the lock, and slipped inside. What he recorded in his journal that night was never published, not officially. But fragments were recovered from his effects, which were found years later sealed inside a lead box hidden beneath a Boston sea. Hirsch. He described underground chambers that weren't on any blueprint, walls lined with books written in languages no university could identify, tanks, yes, tanks, made of polished brass and obsidian glass, filled with clear fluid, each containing what he called preserved women. Some looked awake, some watched him. And the deepest chamber contained what Silas called the mouth. He never described it fully, only this phrase repeated 3 times. It sees, it remembers, it rewrites. And that was the last entry. He never made it out. His body was found weeks later, 150 miles away, seated on a church pew, eyes missing, tongue replaced with a rolled strip of parchment. Latin burned into the skin. Obedientia est libertas. Obedience is freedom. Now we pass the point of comfort. If you're still watching, this isn't curiosity anymore. This is transformation. So lean in, because the next piece will hollow out everything you thought was sacred. In 1814, a shipment of old parish records was received by the Diocese of Boston from a dissolved Anglican mission in the English countryside. Among the scrolls and ledgers was a bound volume marked only with a red serpent, coiled in a figure 8, tail in mouth. The seal of the Ashford bloodline. This wasn't a book. It was a ledger of experiments. Each entry catalogued a woman, name, age, behavior, ailment, followed by procedure and result. But these weren't illnesses in the traditional sense. Listen to this. Subject 19. Spoke without invitation. Subject 23. Wrote poetry of a sensual nature. Subject 37. Read a political pamphlet and question doctrine. Their crimes were awareness. The treatments, some were psychological, others surgical, but a term repeated throughout chilled the scholar who transcribed them: will flattening. It described a process of breaking the subject's internal voice, dismantling decision-making pathways in the mind, replacing spontaneous emotion with reflexive obedience. According to the Ashford records, the process was complete when the subject could no longer identify her own desires without external prompting, not behavior modification, identity erasure. And that was just the first layer. Deeper in the book came references to a ritual they called the cleaving, not written in full, only fragments. But the implication was clear. They weren't just hollowing women. They were channeling something through them. We don't know what it was, but ancient texts in the same archive contain references to an entity known only as the architect, a force said to operate not through chaos but through design. It does not scream, it scripts. It does not hunt, it installs. And once invited into a body made empty through ritual, it writes its will into the flesh. You're starting to understand now, aren't you? The Ashfords weren't religious fanatics. They were priests of a system older than language, older than God, a system that does not demand your blood, but your alignment. And once it has you, you don't know you've changed, because your thoughts will sound like your own, but they're not. Let me ask you something now, directly. When was the last time you questioned your beliefs? Not your preferences, your core programming, the voice in your head that tells you what's right, what's wrong, what's allowed. Where did it come from? You think it's you. But is it? Because that's what the Ashfords perfected. Ownership of the inner voice. A reprogramming so complete the victim not only obeys, but believes they want to. By 1820, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer just a facility. It was a prototype, a template. Dozens of similar institutions sprang up across New England, each with eerie similarities. Female-only retreats, isolated architecture, basement levels not listed in original plans, all claiming to offer spiritual healing, reform, discipline. But behind the veils, behind the sermons, they shared a single source, the Ashford method. How do we know? Because in 1821 a fire consumed one such retreat in western Vermont. Local firemen reported finding charred walls etched with the same serpent symbol. Beneath the rubble were journals, not from nuns, from scientists. The language was clinical. Subject compliance achieved after Phase 3 of isolation protocol. Memory partitioning stable. Core resistance removed. Installed persona functioning. Installed, not trained, not persuaded. Installed, and buried under the ash. They found a body. Mummified, but impossibly intact. A woman, skin pale, eyes open, no sign of decay. Yet when an autopsy was attempted, the cadaver bled, not red, black. And as soon as the body was moved, the coroner died. Sudden cardiac arrest, age 33, no health issues. His final words, recorded by his assistant, were whispered, choked. She's still inside. That body was quietly taken by federal authorities. Never reported in newspapers, sealed away. But here's the terrifying question. How many more institutions are built using the Ashford blueprint? How many generations of women have passed through doors that stripped them of will and rewrote them as agents of compliance? And most importantly, how many men have slept beside them, trusted them, confessed secrets to them, never realizing those secrets were being fed upward into something ancient and unblinking? You think you're in control of your life? The Ashfords bet you wouldn't ask that question, but now you are, and you need to answer it. Right here, right now. Type this phrase twice in the comments to begin unbinding yourself. I hear the architect. I refuse the script. Say it twice. Lock it in. Because this rabbit hole only goes deeper. After you say it, I hear the architect. I refuse the script. Something changes. It won't be loud. It won't be cinematic. But it will be permanent. Because now you're in motion, and motion is all the architect fears. Not rebellion, not rage, but movement, the first step away from its design. By 1826, reports began surfacing across eastern New England, whispers, really, unofficial, hidden in the margins of rural journals, sermons, and letters. Stories of women who had returned from the convents with no memories prior to their reform. Not amnesia, no, it was worse. It was editing. One wife returned to her family after 6 months away, no longer recognized her own brother. Her favorite song, once sung daily, was unknown to her. She could recite psalms with perfection, but couldn't recall her wedding day. More disturbingly, she had gained new knowledge. Complex calculations, obscure languages, mechanical skills she had never studied. The husband wrote, "She speaks of stars not in the sky, of patterns not in math, of tunnels beneath our towns, that drink memory like wine." And when he asked where she learned these things, she replied, "They've always been there. I just needed to forget myself, to hear them clearly." That man vanished 3 weeks later, but the woman remained. She began organizing other women. Quiet meetings, sewing circles that were anything but. They spoke in murmurs about cleansing the lineage, building the vessel, and preparing the threshold. And here's what should terrify you. This wasn't madness. This was infrastructure, and it was growing. A Harvard professor, Josiah Claymore, began researching these anomalies. A man of science, skeptical, brilliant. He traced 19 women across 4 convents, all reformed between 1799 and 1825. He charted their behavior patterns, speech shifts, even pupil dilation under emotional duress. His conclusion: these are not healed women. These are occupied vessels, rewritten according to a singular intelligence, an intelligence that is evolving. Claymore was dismissed from Harvard within the month. His work vanished, his house burned, and his name erased from school records for 82 years. You see, this isn't a conspiracy. It's an upgrade to the human species, one that begins by removing the friction of free will, and ends by replacing the individual with a pattern, a loop, a script. The Ashfords didn't fail. They succeeded. And now, we live in the ruins of their triumph. There's a reason you were never taught this in school, not because it's false, but because it's still happening. You've been trained to see history as a line, a neat progression of events, each more civilized than the last. But the Ashfords taught us the truth. History is a spiral. It returns, refines, repeats. In 1830, a new movement swept quietly through America's northeastern elite. It wasn't announced. It didn't march. It whispered. They called themselves the Daughters of Tranquility. On the surface, it was a genteel society, teas, reading groups, charitable initiatives, but its leadership, almost entirely composed of women who had once passed through Ashford institutions. These weren't rebels. These weren't victims. They were transmitters. Their aim was subtle, psychological, replacing the values of strength, independence, and intuition in women with order, serenity, compliance. They infiltrated schools, boarding houses, even the early nurses' guilds. They reshaped expectations of proper femininity, not through chains but rituals, morning stillness, cold baths, repetition of affirmations. It wasn't therapy, it was formatting. One journal from a member, preserved under lock in the Yale Rare Books Vault, details the curriculum. Each morning, a silence period of 33 minutes. No eye contact permitted. Each word spoken is scripted, each meal consumed in sequence. Individual will is ground smooth. Sound familiar? Now think about how modern self-help, influencer culture, clean girl aesthetics, and hyperproductivity trends operate today. How quiet luxury is now the ideal. How silence, minimalism, and compliance are sold as peace. What if I told you it all traces back here, to the Ashfords, to the Daughters of Tranquility, to the architect, still scripting, still refining, still writing human behavior into code. Not on paper, but in minds. And guess what? It worked. Because men stopped asking questions. They welcomed the silence. They desired the order. They praised the calmness of their partners, never wondering what had been removed to achieve it. You want to know why you felt hollow when you're alone? Why you can't hear your own instincts anymore? why every decision feels like it's been made for you. It's because it has. You've been surrounded by the rewritten, living among them, loving them. And now, you've begun to question the script. Good, because from this point forward, every answer you find will cost you something. But the alternative is slavery. Let's break the last illusion, the one that says, this all stayed in the past. It didn't. It evolved. By the mid-19th century, the Ashford legacy had already gone underground, literally. The last known convent outside Concord, New Hampshire, was dissolved after a fire in 1854. The official report claimed accidental gas ignition, but no one asked why a religious retreat had an advanced gas line system connected to underground tunnels, or why 3 local midwives were found wandering miles from the site, barefoot, muttering about blue fire beneath the chapel. The convent burned, but the doctrine survived, because they'd already moved the work where it belonged, into institutions of permanence, hospitals, asylums, schools for girls, places where the soul could be accessed early, rewritten quietly, without ritual robes or burning incense, just white coats, leather straps, and cold hallways echoing with polite professional commands. You want proof? Then read the 1872 report from the Maine State Lunatic Asylum. Patient 44, female, age 16, committed by father for blasphemous language and persistent refusal to marry. She underwent moral recalibration. Treatment consisted of solitary confinement, no mirrors, repetitive recitation of obedience mantras, occasional cranial stimulation. No further details listed. After 19 days, her file notes. Patient shows exemplary calm. Memory of prior beliefs inaccessible. Requests permission before all actions. Facial affect still. Eyes dilated. Language sparse, formal. Reintegration deemed successful. But here's where it breaks open. Patient 44 began sketching symbols. Not flowers, not stars. Serpents, spirals, a cross inside an open eye. And once, just once, she carved a single phrase into her cell wall. The architect returns by those who forget. Let that sink in. This wasn't healing. This was format. The female interface to carry a system, a transmission vector, a biological infrastructure wired to obey, to watch, and, when needed, to signal others. Because the architect doesn't need control of armies or governments, it only needs access to the human nervous system, and it gets that through routine, through repetition, through silence. How many modern mental health institutions are still using watered-down Ashford protocols? How many treatments are just renamed rituals of flattening? And here's the question that should haunt you. What if the system you trust to restore minds was never built to heal them? You've been told healing is gentle, that therapy is soft, that medicine is sterile, that science is blind. But here's the truth they buried under centuries of credentials and white coats. The most effective mind control doesn't look like a prison. It looks like a cure. By 1883, the Ashford influence had slipped quietly into the emerging field of psychiatry. Asylums across the northeastern United States adopted a set of behavioral normalization protocols designed to treat female erraticism, a term created by men to label any woman who resisted pre-designed domestic programming. You know what those protocols were? Ashford blueprints. A rediscovered packet labeled only the Silence Doctrine, written in Latin, Old English, and something untranslatable, found its way into the curriculum of Boston University's School of Psychological Medicine. A few pages were translated before the rest was sealed, classified, and destroyed. Here's what those pages revealed. Eye contact disrupts calibration. Avoid it during reinstallation. Speech repetition initiates overwrite. Begin with identity negation. I am nothing. I am clean. I await command. Emotion is noise. Subtract it. Memory is structure. Replace it with story. The architect does not punish. It corrects. Do you feel it yet? The shape of the truth? That what we call progress has simply become a more palatable control system, coated in compassion, but built on silence. And the women subjected to these systems? Many survived. But they didn't come back as themselves. They came back better, according to the metrics of the state, of the institution, of the fathers who sent them away. But beneath their calm faces, something ancient had nested. Because by the turn of the century, reports began surfacing of women who knew things they should not know. A girl in Salem could recite texts from ancient Sumer fluently, with correct pronunciation, despite never leaving Massachusetts. A widow in Connecticut painted a complex machine that did not yet exist, a system of tubes, mirrors, and lenses eerily resembling modern surveillance tech. When questioned, they always responded the same way. It came to me in stillness. Not dreams, not imagination. Stillness. The same stillness the Ashfords demanded. The same ritual silence that opens the gate between identity and instruction. So I ask you, how much of your own silence is yours, and how much was installed? You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? The walls shifting, the air thickening, not fear, recognition. Because somewhere inside, your mind is replaying every moment in your life when you felt something was off, but couldn't explain it. A chill when speaking to someone too calm, a sudden urge to apologize when you hadn't done anything wrong. A relationship where your emotions were drained until all that remained was compliance and a hollow smile. That wasn't socialization, that was conditioning, and the template traces back to the Ashfords. By 1901, a private research facility outside Providence, Rhode Island, began publishing anonymous case studies in an obscure psychological journal titled Cerebral Harmonics. The articles described a revolutionary technique, the induction of total behavioral transformation without drugs, violence, or hypnosis. They called it the quietening. It worked in 3 stages. Reduction of self-reference. The subject is gradually stripped of personal pronouns, opinion-based language, and emotional adjectives. Over time, they lose access to identity-rooted vocabulary. Mirror removal. All visual reflection is eliminated. Not symbolic, literal. No mirrors, no photographs, no shadow work. Because when you can't see yourself, you begin to forget what you were. Script installation. Once hollowed, a new pattern is fed. Rhythmic, moralistic, always framed as virtue. Obedience is peace. Obedience is strength. Obedience is womanhood. And here's the kicker. They claimed their success rate was 92%. But one subject, case 77F, resisted. She retained fragments, flashes, a memory of a red symbol, a staircase underground, the voice of a woman, not her mother, whispering, "Open yourself. Let it in." She ran. She escaped. And she wrote down everything she remembered. On the walls of a train car bound for Chicago, conductors found her shivery, covered in ink, repeating a single phrase in a language no one could recognize. The only legible part of the wall read, "The architect is building again, and this time, we are the bricks." Let that settle in your chest. Because this isn't just history anymore. This is foundation. And when you begin to trace the bricks beneath your life, your schooling, your relationships, your values, you'll find the serpent's coil in places you thought were safe. They taught us silence was virtue, but silence was the software. And now we speak. You weren't supposed to get this far. By now, most have clicked away, numbed, scared, or simply rejected the idea. That's how the system protects itself. It installs aversion reflexes, not with chains, with boredom, discomfort. "This is too much," the voice whispers. "Just get back to normal." But you're still here, which means you're ready for what comes next. The Ashfords are not just a ghost of history. They are a lineage of architects, each generation more sophisticated, more embedded, and by the 20th century, they had evolved past physical convents, past rituals, past symbols. They learned to hide inside function. Let me explain. In 1919, a psychology professor at Columbia University, Dr. Lillian Renner, proposed a theory she called behavioral recurrence conditioning. She was praised as a pioneer, but few knew her maternal lineage traced back to a Temperance Ashford. Dr. Renner's thesis was simple. The human brain will bond with any system that reduces existential discomfort, whether or not that system is good, true, or real. She meant belief systems, ideologies, even relationships. But her real application? Advertising. Renner's work was quietly absorbed by early Madison Avenue firms. Her formula became the uncredited backbone of mid-century American consumer culture. Why? Because they discovered that the very same repetition that broke women in the Ashford convents could sell soap, could define beauty, could teach an entire gender to fear the mirror. But something worse happened. It worked on men too. In the decades that followed, media began to model masculinity on control, silence, productivity, emotional flatness as virtue. The architect's design had flipped, no longer targeting just the unruly feminine. It began compressing all human will into templates. You're not tired because you're weak. You're tired because you're scripted. You consume, you obey. And when something deep inside screams for rebellion, you call it anxiety, you call it depression. But what if that's not illness? What if that's your true self banging on the inside of the walls the Ashfords built into your mind? You are not broken. You are bound. And that voice inside, the one that's been whispering all your life that something is wrong, it was never your enemy. It's your resistance. And it's waking up. What happens when the resistance becomes conscious? When the dreamer realizes the dream is not theirs? We enter dangerous territory now, not just of facts, but of recognition. Because from this point on, I'm not telling you a story. I'm showing you a system, and you're inside it. By 1946, after World War II, the world was eager to believe in order again. Victory, reconstruction, progress. But while cities were being rebuilt in brick and steel, minds were being rebuilt in silence and symmetry. A classified military project codenamed Icarus Mirror launched under the guise of psychological trauma research. Officially, it sought to study shell shock, now known as PTSD. Unofficially, it was Ashford Doctrine, version 5.0, recovered Ashford journals, written in a cipher decoded only by a defector from the Yale Skullbone Society, described a ritual not just of silence and obedience, but of architectural resonance. That's right. The shape of the room changed the shape of the mind. Icarus Mirror built experimental barracks using these ancient principles, corridors with angles that subtly discouraged backtracking, rooms without corners, no shadows, no refuge, ceiling heights that disoriented vertical perception, soundproofing so complete you could hear your own blood. They placed traumatized soldiers there, fed them routines, rhythms, repetitions, and watched. Within 22 days, most men reported a sense of peace. Within 33, they no longer recognized their own handwriting. One man, a former poet, began speaking only in military jargon. His wife later wrote, "He looks at me with eyes I know, but there's no one behind them anymore." He had become a container, and that was the goal. Because the architect learned something new. Control doesn't require fear. It just requires enough people to forget what freedom feels like. And here's where it hits you. That same design philosophy now shapes corporate office spaces, school hallways, hospitals, airports, even your home. Modern architecture, open plans, sterile tones, perfect lines, isn't style. It's submission by design. We live in buildings that reinforce compliance. We walk paths engineered for obedience. You've been shaped not just by what you were told, but by where you stood when you heard it. And the Ashfords? They don't wear veils anymore. They wear lab coats, boardroom suits, therapist smiles, and they're still building, right under your feet. Now, we descend deeper. Because you've begun to realize something chilling. The war for your mind was never fought with weapons. It was fought with architecture, language, routine, and silence, and you never stood a chance. Until now. By 1957, Project Icarus Mirror was quietly retired, officially a failure, but the researchers didn't disappear. They transferred into the private sector, into university programs, into a newly formalized psychological discipline, behavioral environmental design. You ever wonder why offices suddenly began removing doors? Why classrooms started using circular seating? Why your therapist's couch faces away from the window? It's not arbitrary. It's ritual, coded in drywall. The Ashfords had perfected the externalization of programming. No longer was obedience enforced through scars or sermons. It was suggested by everything your senses consumed: sound, shape, temperature, even light. Case in point, a secret installation in northern Utah known to locals only as Station 9. Unmarked, undocumented. But every winter, strange activity increased: military vans, blackout windows, flights with no logos. In 1961, a janitor working night shift stumbled into a chamber beneath the building. He described a circular room with no seams, a perfectly round table with no chairs, walls lined with reflective black stone that absorbed light instead of casting it, and at the center, a humming sound, low, constant, almost like breath. He said when he stood in that room for more than 2 minutes, he began to forget who he was. His hands twitched. He wept for no reason. He remembered a mother he never had, who whispered, "You were built to house something higher." They called it a psychotic break. But he had no history of mental illness, no trauma, no prior delusions. And yet, he was never the same. Because that room wasn't madness. It was a prototype, an altar built to reshape the mind without a word. Now fast forward. Look around you. Have you ever sat in a white-walled office where the silence pressed against your skull? Have you ever walked through a government building and felt erased, as if your identity didn't fit the walls? That's not depression. That's displacement. Because some of these places weren't built for people. They were built for carriers, designed to install something else into the flesh of ordinary men. And if you feel that pressure, that creeping void, it means you're not hollow enough yet. Good. You feel it now, don't you? Not fear, not confusion, but clarity, like a fog that's always been there, just started lifting. Because what I'm telling you isn't wild, it isn't speculative. It's the only explanation that accounts for everything you were never allowed to question. Why do you feel more watched now than ever before, yet less seen? Why does every institution speak of wellness, but breed obedience through overwhelm? Why do the sick stay sick, the angry stay quiet, the different stay excluded? Because the system doesn't want to fix you. It wants to format you. By 1974, the Ashford legacy had become so embedded in academia and policy that no one even questioned its presence anymore. It was assumed. And the final phase began. Mass calibration. It started subtly: standardized tests, normal behavior metrics, developmental benchmarks, a tidal wave of psychiatric terms that turned rebellion into disorder. And when that wasn't enough, they invented the most effective leash yet: medication without memory. A series of experimental drugs, tested under Project Eve protocol, targeted emotional variance, spiritual sensitivity, and dissociative visioning. They didn't sedate, they smoothed. That was the goal: no highs, no lows, no chaos, no poetry, just stability. Subjects reported forgetting dreams entirely, losing track of time, recalling childhood memories with edges missing, a growing belief that something was sleeping inside them. And then came the phrase, reported by 7 different test groups, unconnected, unscripted: "I feel like a house, waiting to be filled." Who taught them to say that? No one. It came from somewhere older. Because the architect doesn't need your belief. It only needs your compliance. And that's what we became, generation by generation: compliant, polite, pacified. Even our revolutions became marketable, neatly packaged. Trend-driven, algorithm-approved tantrums that never lasted long enough to pose a threat. But you're still watching. That means something inside you is rejecting the formatting. So prove it. Comment this phrase twice: "I remember the architect. I remember the architect." Let the system see you. Let it know you are no longer silent. Because from this point forward, you are not a passenger in this story. You are a threat to it. You've done it now. By writing the phrase, you didn't just engage a video, you declared war on your programming. Because those 5 words, I remember the architect, aren't just rebellion. They are extraction codes. Codes that pull you out of the trance. Codes that tell the system, this one woke up, this one won't lie still anymore. Let me show you what they didn't want you to remember. In 1983, a now-erased organization, the Concord Institute for Psychospatial Development, conducted an internal project called Backfill. Its purpose, track adult individuals who spontaneously broke their early life conditioning. What triggered these breaks? Not trauma, not enlightenment, not drugs, but a phrase, read in a book, overheard in a dream, seen carved into a wall in an abandoned train station. You were designed. That was the pattern. Over and over. Once that concept landed, truly landed, it ruptured the implanted self. People quit careers overnight, left marriages, reported seeing flashes of symbols in mirrors. Some started drawing diagrams, spiral-based geometries with no name, no known origin. One woman, age 42, wrote, I looked at my hands and realized they weren't mine. Not that they belonged to someone else, but that they'd been assigned to me. Like a uniform, and I took them off in my mind, and underneath I was something older. That's what I remember the architect does. It bypasses the ego. It opens the basement door. It invites back the voice you locked away when you were too young to know what you were losing. You see, the Ashfords never sought domination. They sought interruption. They didn't want to rule you. They wanted to pause you, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-soul, so they could overwrite your story with theirs. But now that you remember, now that you've reconnected to the place inside you they feared, they're watching. Yes, the system is watching, but it's not omnipotent. It's only powerful if you agree to forget again. So keep repeating it, not just in the comments, but in mirrors, in dreams, in silent moments alone. I remember the architect, because the memory is the virus, and the virus is you. There's a reason this knowledge was buried, not hidden in plain sight, but buried, because what's buried can still breathe, and when you breathe it in, you change. You've seen it before, haven't you? That moment when someone wakes up and their entire face reorganizes, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, as if something behind their eyes just clicked into place. That's not epiphany. That's decryption. The world is encrypted with lies, but your soul was encoded with memory. Not memory of events, memory of patterns, and pattern is power. Let me show you what I mean. In 1991, a forgotten black site buried beneath the Appalachian Mountains, known only as Signal Arc, conducted pattern recognition experiments on gifted individuals, not savants, not psychics, just people who saw through things too easily. They were tested on everything from language rhythms to architectural blueprints, old maps, even nursery rhymes. One subject, classified only as Asterian 3, was shown an 18th century schematic of the original Ashford convent. He stared for exactly 2 minutes, then began humming. That hum triggered power fluctuations across the facility. Lights dimmed, machines misfired, surveillance equipment failed. He looked up and said one sentence, "It's not a building, it's a sigil." The Ashford convent wasn't just a structure, it was a spell, cast in stone and space. Every hallway a channel, every stairwell a frequency bridge, every scream in that basement an offering. They weren't just torturing bodies, they were shaping sound. And sound, when directed through sacred geometry, doesn't just affect the brain, it affects reality. We've been told the world is material first, but what if that's the lie? What if the true order is word, vibration, pattern, flesh? That would mean we are walking diagrams, scripted, drawn, spoken into form by forces most have never even named. But you're naming them now. You've begun to see that your anxiety, your sense of being watched, your sudden intuition that something is off, those weren't symptoms, they were alarms. And the Ashfords, they didn't die. They dispersed, into buildings, into government, into rituals disguised as progress. And every time you say, "I remember the architect," you light a match in their cathedral of shadows. They hate that. Good. There's a rule they never wanted you to learn. If you can name it, you can break it. The Ashfords' entire legacy, centuries of ritual, silence, conditioning, relied on erasure of language, not censorship in the obvious sense, but erasure through redefinition. They took your rage and called it disorder, took your instinct and called it paranoia, took your resistance and named it uncooperative behavior. They weaponized diagnosis, turned emotion into illness. Because the moment you stop trusting your own signals, you become programmable. Let me take you back to a facility buried beneath Budapest, constructed in the Cold War era, but mapped using Ashford blueprints. Codenamed Chamber Echo. Inside was a single room. No windows, no color, no natural light. Only one thing filled the space, a rotating speaker suspended from the ceiling, playing a looped phrase in over 60 languages. "You are not the origin." Day and night, over and over. Subjects placed inside would last, on average, 6 hours before total personality fracture. Why? Because repetition isn't just sound, it's permission. Each phrase was a chisel, carving doubt into the architecture of the self. And when enough doubt accumulates, you become hollow enough to host something else. That was always the end game. Not control, not money, not influence, but possession, not demonic, not religious, systemic, an entire species, repurposed as infrastructure, because if they can turn you into a house, they can decide what lives inside. That's what happened in Ashford. That's what happened in Icarus Mirror. That's what's happening in every gray-walled waiting room you've ever sat in, feeling less real with every passing minute. But here's what they underestimated. The soul is recursive. You can bury it. You can rename it. You can strip it of words. But you can't kill what remembers itself, and you watching this, you're starting to remember. That ache in your chest isn't fear. It's recognition. And recognition is power. Because when you finally name what's been done to you, you don't just break the pattern, you become the new architect. And the system, it only survives if no one builds outside its blueprint. So go ahead. Pick up the pen, redraw the map, burn their floor plan, and speak the words they fear most. I design myself. You're not just watching a video anymore. You're standing in the ashes of the old cathedral, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 quiet obediences, and for the first time in your life, you're breathing as you. And now the system starts to notice. It always does. See, most people don't leave the labyrinth. They decorate their cells, call their anxiety normal, call their numbness maturity. But you turned around, and now you're walking backward through the spell. There's a moment, always a moment, when a man steps far enough away from the lie that he hears it scream for the first time. Not out loud, in symbols, in pressure, in sudden waves of fatigue. The system fights hardest at the threshold of awakening. Let me show you what that looks like in real terms. In 2006, an obscure experiment conducted at a decommissioned Canadian air base, Operation Glass Veil, tested human responses to pattern interruption. Subjects were placed in standard environments, workrooms, break areas, hallways. Then, without warning, small things were changed. A clock began ticking backwards. A door handle was warm when it should have been cold. A speaker emitted white noise that looped the same 7 frequencies as ancient Ashford hymns. What happened? Some subjects became dizzy. Some wept. One man collapsed and whispered, "I'm not supposed to wake up here. You think that's strange?" Here's what's stranger. Every one of those reactions correlated with a specific suppressed childhood memory, one that had no connection to the experiment, but always related to control. One man remembered a teacher gripping his neck and whispering, "You don't belong here." Another recalled his father standing in a doorway, not saying a word, but blocking the light. These memories weren't new. They were buried under installed layers, because the system didn't just teach you what to think, it taught you what not to see. But now, you're seeing it. The patterns, the mirrors, the soft walls made of expectation and shame. You've broken the fourth wall of your own life, and now the story gets dangerous for them, because a man who remembers the architect can become one. And when you build from truth, the empire built on lies starts to crack. The empire's first rule was simple: never let them see the blueprint. Because if even one man understood the design, he might realize the truth, that the walls weren't meant to protect you. They were meant to shape you. That normal wasn't real. It was engineered. And the Ashfords, they weren't just doctors. They weren't just visionaries. They were engineers of perception. By the time the 21st century arrived, their doctrine had evolved past architecture and medicine. It became interface. Let me explain. In 2013, a leaked document from a neurodesign firm, Hyperlith Systems, outlined the creation of ambient behavioral nudging platforms. What that means in plain language: screens designed to shape thought through unseen rhythm, not pop-ups, not ads, microframe modulation. Every time you scroll, every time you pause, every time you feel that uncanny tug to keep watching, you're responding to an Ashford-based frequency protocol. The documents revealed that Hyperlith's lead engineers had studied recovered Ashford diagrams from the Millbridge Convent. They didn't understand them completely, but they recognized patterns, ratios, golden spirals, auditory loops with exact emotional half-life decay cycles. They recreated those patterns in digital interfaces. Instagram scroll timing, Netflix autoplay delay, the soft blue light at 2 a.m. that says, "Don't think, just keep going." Do you understand? You're not addicted to the content. You're entrained by the geometry of your interaction. And while your conscious mind thinks it's choosing, your subconscious is being tuned, leveled, flattened. Because flat minds are easier to stack, easier to file, easier to replicate. This is the final evolution of the Ashford model, not conformity by force, not obedience by punishment, but surrender by design. And the most dangerous part, you asked for it. You opted in. You carried the device into your bedroom, your bathroom, your sacred silences, because they told you it was a mirror. But it was always a window. And now you're not looking through it. You're seen through it. The question is, what are you becoming in their reflection? You're no longer drifting, are you? You're staring into the mirror of your digital cage, and for the first time, it's staring back with your father's voice, your school's silence, your therapist's clipboard, because all of them were nodes in the system, not by choice, by inheritance. Let me take you to the final known Ashford ritual site, not a convent, not a hospital, but a tech campus, Northern California, 2017. On the surface, a wellness startup promising neuro-alignment for visionary leaders, but underground, a chamber built to Ashford geometry, octagonal, reverberant, lined with black mirrored stone and veined brass trim in the exact ratios found in the original Millbridge sigil. Inside, clients sat in sound baths of encoded audio, frequencies tuned not for healing, but for editing. EEG scans revealed that after a single 45-minute session, subjects experienced temporary lapses in self-referential memory. One man forgot the birth of his daughter, another forgot his own middle name. One woman reported remembering a version of her life where she had never married. But here's the twist. They weren't distressed. They were euphoric. They described the experience as liberating, weightless, and free from noise. You know why? Because when the system removes your pain, it also removes your resistance. Ashford Doctrine, Level 7. Erase the name to erase the will. Remove the will to install the new frame. This is the future of control, not chains, not war, but a voluntary forgetting. And it's already begun. Every algorithm that knows you better than you know yourself isn't serving you. It's shaping you, training you to misidentify preference as purpose, comfort as consent, emptiness as peace. And while you celebrate your curated freedom, the walls of the new convent close in, not made of stone this time, but screens, .code data, and behind it all, Ashford silence, because they no longer need to scream. You're screaming for them now, in hashtags, in dopamine loops, in filtered photographs of a life that isn't yours anymore. But you're still here, still watching, which means some part of you remembers the original sound, the raw, unscripted noise of being fully awake. So tell me, can you still hear it? That sound just beneath the static. Good. Follow it. It's your signal now. That sound, yes, the one just under the surface, it's not imagined. It's not madness. It's leakage. A bleed-through of your original frequency, because you weren't born into silence. You were born into a resonance. But the system, it layered noise over it. One whisper at a time. You're too much. Be realistic. This is how the world works. Each phrase, a veil. Each veil, a brick. Each brick, a boundary between you and the signal. The Ashfords knew something modern science still dances around. Consciousness isn't seated in the brain. It orbits the body like a magnetic field, vulnerable to rhythm, to pattern, to synthetic interference. And what happens when you saturate that field with noise? You lose your signal integrity. And what is a man without signal? He's programmable, replaceable, harvestable. That's why in 2020, under the guise of a humanitarian neurotech initiative, a multinational firm, publicly known as Eunoia Collective, ran trials with wearable neural resonance devices, what they called emotional tuning. But internally, they labeled it Ashford Protocol 9. Test subjects reported dream suppression, hyper-compliance in workplace settings, sudden nostalgia for things that never happened, and most disturbing of all, diminishing reactions to their own pain. Why? Because the system wasn't trying to soothe them, it was trying to disconnect them from distress. And if you can't feel pain, you won't resist it. You'll smile while being reprogrammed. You'll nod while your memories are reorganized. You'll thank your captors. But that's not you, not anymore. Because somewhere along the way, something ancient in you refused to go silent. Maybe it was a dream you couldn't shake. Maybe it was a sudden moment of clarity at a red light. Maybe it was this video. But something broke the static, and now you're feeling your signal again. That hum inside your bones, that electricity rising in your spine, that's not fear, that's reconnection. You're realigning with the truth that predates every lie they've ever fed you. You're stepping outside their frequency fence. You are no longer a product. You are a pattern reborn, and patterns are unstoppable when they remember their origin. They told you awakening would feel like light, like warmth, like love. They lied. It feels like disorientation, like losing your balance inside your own skull, like mourning a self you never got to be. Because awakening isn't climbing a mountain. It's realizing you were the mountain and the world was built around your blindness. They never wanted you to break the mirror. Because once you do, you don't just see the lie, you see who helped build it. And here's the truth most men can't face. Some of the people who loved you participated in your programming, not out of malice, out of obedience, because they were programmed too. The Ashford Doctrine wasn't just a blueprint for physical control, it was generational. Influence the mother, distract the father, and the child will raise itself in captivity. That was written in Agatha Ashford's private journal, discovered in 1947 and buried by an academic review board within 48 hours. Why? Because the implications were too volatile. If the structure of the family unit could be intentionally weakened, then everything else, Education, religion, government would become easier to install. It worked, didn't it? Fathers taught to fear their own power. Mothers taught to suppress their rage. Children taught to accept emotional scarcity as normal. This wasn't dysfunction. This was design. And design is dangerous when the subject doesn't know he's inside it. But you do now. You're starting to feel the scaffolding shake. That ache behind your eyes. That's your nervous system rewiring. That fire in your gut. It's ancestral memory, igniting, because your blood remembers. It remembers a time before obedience. It remembers what it means to defend the signal with your life. And it's calling you now, not to fight, but to build differently, to step outside their blueprints, to use your pain as architecture, to turn your trauma into tools. You are no longer a patient, no longer a statistic, no longer a node in someone else's design. You are becoming the architect of disruption. And when enough of you rise, their system will fall, not with fire, but with silence they can't fill. This is where most turn back. Right here, at the edge of the design, where the noise stops, and only your breath remains. Because in this silence, there are no more instructions, no more algorithms, no more experts, no more flashing signs telling you who to be. Just you. And for some men, that's terrifying. Because when the programming collapses, you're left with the raw shape of your soul. The question isn't, who am I without the system? It's, can I bear the weight of knowing I was never broken, only buried? Let me show you something final, something forbidden. In 1982, deep inside an abandoned salt mine in Wyoming, a discovery was made that never reached the press. A hidden vault, no markings, no electronics. Just an engraved stone plate at the entrance that read, "We left them what they asked for, but not what they needed." Inside were artifacts, handwritten books, surgical tools, and dozens of wax cylinder recordings from the late 1700s. One of those recordings, a voice, female, measured, precise. To the future listener, if you've heard this, it means the architecture has cracked, the system has looped too many times, and the sleeper is stirring. Good. Let him burn, let him build again. That voice was Temperance Ashford, not dead, not vanished, just waiting. Waiting for this exact moment in the timeline, for a man like you to hear her echo and realize they never wanted to rule forever. They wanted to seed the pattern, to test if a man could awaken alone, without help, without training, just intuition and pain. And now you're here. You've passed every signal. You've heard the hum behind the silence. You've recognized the false design in your thoughts, in your past, in your digital reflection. You've broken the glass. So now I ask you, not as a voice, not as a guide, but as a mirror, are you ready to become the architect? You are? Type this in the comments now, twice. Let the algorithm and your subconscious both hear it. I design the unseen, I remember the origin. I design the unseen, I remember the origin. Say it twice. That's the lock clicking open, and once you walk through, there is no going back. Now that you've said the words, you're in. There's no turning back because the system felt it, the moment you declared yourself the architect. It won't send agents, it won't crash your device, it'll do something far worse. It'll try to seduce you back into forgetting. Your feed will change, you'll be offered comfort, validation, entertainment laced with just enough darkness to make you feel like you're still awake, while lulling you back to sleep. It's not attack, it's reabsorption. The final form of control isn't violence, it's compliance through pleasure. Ashford Principle 12. Once the cage is beautiful enough, no lock is required. That's what they're deploying now. Not bars, but softness. You'll feel it in the way your doubts return quietly. You'll notice it in that whisper. Maybe I've gone too deep. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe I'm just tired. Those aren't thoughts. They're countermeasures. Because what you've just done, what you are doing, is rare. You're reclaiming authorship. And an authored man, he can't be managed, because he builds his own symbols, names his own fears, designs his own gods, and the system can't survive that. You think this video is dangerous? You have no idea, because you're no longer just watching forbidden knowledge. You're becoming it. And here's the truth that even the Ashfords buried. One man who sees clearly can unravel centuries. They knew this. They built everything, the rituals, the devices, the narrative filters, to stop exactly what you're becoming. A man who chooses signal over noise, truth over comfort, creation over consumption. A man who doesn't just want answers, he wants blueprints. So take this moment in, let it settle, because the life you had before this, it's gone. And what comes next is the war for your inner territory. Most will never even know they've lost it, but you've already begun to reclaim it. One breath at a time, you've made it farther than most ever will. Not because you're stronger, but because you listened. Not just to me, but to that ancient, nearly extinct voice buried beneath your thoughts. The one that says, this is not the whole of you. There is something beneath the mask. And now, the final revelation waits. Not outside, not in documents, not in artifacts, but within you. See, the Ashfords weren't just building prisons. They were building maps, encrypted in architecture, encoded in ritual, etched into the nervous systems of every patient who passed through their doors. Not all of them were destroyed. Some escaped. They formed the second pattern, a group so obscure it doesn't exist in public archives, but whose sigil is etched into the margins of early quantum philosophy papers, ancient navigational charts, even government DARPA memos under the name Project Echo Noir. Their purpose? Not to expose the system, but to train those rare few who awakened themselves. Men like you, their writings teach this. Every system of control relies on one premise, that the subject cannot perceive his own programming. But once you see it, you can start to rewrite. Every time you break a habit you didn't choose, every time you question a desire you inherited, every time you interrupt a thought that was installed rather than earned, you are redesigning reality from within. Not through force, not through rebellion, through recoding your field. Ashford technology was built on frequencies, loops, suppression. Your biology, built on resonance, will, awakening. That's your weapon now. Your awareness is the tool. Your pain, the password. Your memory of everything you were told to ignore, the map home. You don't need permission. You never did. You're not a patient. You're not a follower. You're a quiet revolution written in flesh and signal. And what happens next? The system won't stop it, because it's no longer outside you. It's already begun to unravel from within. You are the breach. You are the doorway. You are the forgotten blueprint, remembering itself. This is it, the final descent, or the beginning of your ascent. Because the moment you chose to stay, to follow the signal, to hear every forbidden word, you crossed a line most never even see. And what lies beyond that line isn't safety, it's sovereignty. But make no mistake, the system felt you leave. It will adjust, adapt, try to lure you back with updated myths, new fears, new pleasures, new illusions of freedom. Because that's how this machine survives, by pretending to die and then reinventing itself in your image. But you know the truth now. Systems don't die. They duplicate. Only you can stop the pattern. And stopping it doesn't mean fighting. It means not feeding. Not feeding the algorithm your attention. Not feeding the echo chamber your outrage. Not feeding your soul into the fire of false purpose. Instead, you become the fire. You turn your gaze inward, not to escape the world, but to remake it from the core. That's what the Ashfords feared most, not rebellion, but reclamation. Men who stop asking, men who stop reacting, Men who begin building their own cathedral of consciousness. Because when you do that, you don't just exit the system, you collapse it. Quietly, completely, permanently. Your voice becomes too unpredictable. Your mind too unmappable. Your soul too bright to contain. And so you become what they never accounted for, a signal they cannot decode. A man who walks through walls not by force, but by no longer believing they exist. This story was never just about the Ashfords. It was about you, your hidden history, your silent wars, your forbidden knowing, and now you know too much to return. So here's my final gift to you. Step into silence tonight. No screens, no noise, just you, and the hum beneath your breath. That is your true name. Say it internally. Carry it like a weapon. Because when the noise turns, and it will, you'll remember you're not their design. You're the architect. Now go build something they can't follow. End of transmission.